And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and this is 10 cards you should be putting in your commander decks. We are starting out this week with Hive Mind. 5 and a blue enchantment. Whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell, each other player copies that spell. Each of those players may choose new targets for their copy. Really crazy, interesting card. You know, in a sort of chaos theme, it can be really fun. Every time any player cast an instant or sorcery spell, each other player gets to copy it. There is some shenanigans you can get into here where you cast like a Summoner's Pact, for example, and then each of your opponents are going to copy that spell. They don't have a choice. You actually have to copy it. So they'll get their Summoner's Pact. They'll go get a green creature out of their deck, but of course, if they're not playing green, that does nothing. And then on their upkeep, if they can't pay that 2 green, they'll lose the game. So this can knock out a couple of your opponents that aren't playing green. However, this card I think got a lot better with the Magecraft ability that came out in Strixhaven whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, right? So for example, if you're playing a Veyran deck, Voice of Duality, it's a pretty great inclusion in that deck, right? Because you are copying an instant or sorcery spell with this. Every time your opponents play an instant or sorcery, you're going to copy it, and you're going to get a Veyran trigger. If you casting or copying an instant or sorcery spell causes a triggered ability to trigger, you're going to do it an additional time, right? So I think it's extra good there. Coming in at number 2 this week is a personal favorite of mine, Holistic Wisdom. 1 green enchantment. This is just such an interesting card. You pay 2, exile a card from your hand. Return target card from your graveyard to your hand if it shares a card type with the card exiled this way. Have this card in my Questing Beast deck because I just came across it around the same time I was making that deck, and I just thought I'm going to throw this in there and see how it works, right? Again, like I've said many times, when you're playing a monocolored deck, that's sort of the advantage, is you get to try out neat and interesting cards like this. I really like this card late in a game, right? Late in a game when there's lots of stuff in your graveyard that you might want, and you're drawing stuff off the top of your library that maybe you don't want. So for example, I draw a Cultivate off the top of my library. Don't really need that late in a game. Now I can exile it from my hand and get a sorcery, right? Because that's the card type you're looking for. Any sorcery out of my graveyard, I can now return to my hand. Can be really, really fantastic that way, where it's sort of just giving you value out of maybe dead draws later in the game. As an added bonus though, as I mentioned in my last 10 cards video, Hero of Bredegard, a very underplayed card, I think, combos with Holistic Wisdom because you are exiling cards from your hand, so it also works there. Coming in at number 3 this week, and this is a really interesting one. I got a few really interesting blue enchantments in this episode. Homerid Spawning Bed. Blue and a blue enchantment. Pay 1 blue and sacrifice a blue creature. Create X 1/1 blue Camerid creature tokens. X is the sacrificed creature's mana value. Very weird card. First of all, I'm sacrificing stuff in blue, which you don't see very often. You know, this to me feels very much like a black card. That's one of the reasons why I'm giving it a mention, is because it's doing something yet you don't typically see in blue. It's creating Camerid creature tokens. You know, I'm not sure what that's supposed to be exactly. I actually looked it up. There's only one other card in the game that has that Camerid creature type, which is also a very unusual card. Just creating tokens. There's no actual cards with that creature type. I just think it's a very unique effect in blue. If you're looking for a sack outlet where I sacrifice a creature, create a bunch of creature tokens, it's the creature's mana value, okay, which can be really important. Hello, Scornful Egotist. That's a great fit there. Also, if you have maybe a sneak attack effect where I sneak something really, really big into play, it's going to get sacrificed on the end step anyway, so pay 3 mana and turn it into a bunch of tokens might be a good idea as well. Very interesting card that I think could fit in a couple of decks. Speaking of creating those creature tokens, coming in at number 4, Hour of Need. 2 and a blue, instant, has Strive. This spell costs 1 and a blue more to cast for each target beyond the first. Exile any number of target creatures. For each creature exiled this way, its controller creates a 4/4 blue Sphinx creature token with flying. Basically, I'm paying 3 mana to exile an opponent's creature at instant speed. Okay, that's not bad. The fact that you're giving them a 4/4 Sphinx with flying is not great. I mean, that's obviously a lot better than just a 3/3 vanilla token. However, where I really like this card is the versatility of I can use it on myself as well. So back to the Homerid spawning bed, now I have a whole bunch of those little Camerid 1/1 tokens. I can exile a bunch of them and instead transform them into 4/4 blue Sphinx creature tokens with flying, which of course is way more menacing. So I also like the versatility of I can use this on my own creatures. Coming in at number 5, Hercules Recall, 1 and a blue instant. Return all artifacts target player owns to their hand. Really powerful effect. You don't see this card in Commander very often. It only targets a certain player. Artifacts they own, which can be really important, right? The wording there is certainly important. If you have, I don't know, an artifact commander and your opponent steals it with a blatant thievery, you can now bounce it back to your hand, I suppose. Typically though, you know, if I'm playing in a game, there's always going to be that one guy that has an abundance of artifacts. Even if no one in the game is playing an artifact themed deck, just my opponent has 2 or 3 mana rocks out. For 2 mana, I bounce them all back to their hand and slow them down. But against an artifact theme, right? The one guy in the game who's playing that artifact deck, this can just completely hose them. Also bounces tokens, right? That's really the big part here. This is another card that I think has gotten a lot better recently with all those dang treasure tokens and all those clue tokens. I mean, tokens just seem to be everywhere lately in the format, and all those tokens are going to be artifacts which we will bounce to our opponent's hands, and of course then they just evaporate, they disappear into nothingness. Also can be fantastic against a Voltron deck. You know, that's typically where this card got used back in the day. I would see it a lot more when I first started playing Commander. It was a great card against a Voltron deck because they would stack all that equipment on their commander, which typically would have hexproof or shroud or something, so you couldn't target it. This would bounce all that equipment back to their hand, and then you could just easily block their commander and kill it. So it's just really a versatile card that can be used for a lot of different situations to save your butt, I think. Coming in at number 6, Hymn of Rebirth, 3 green and a white sorcery. Put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. Very interesting card, and I know it might not seem like much, but when I saw this card, I quickly looked it up, and this is the only non-black card that gets a creature card out of an opponent's graveyard. I think that's where this card is really significant. I always like to mention the cards that are off color and doing something that you don't normally see in certain color combinations. So this is the only non-black card that does this. Gets a creature card out of an opponent's graveyard, and gets something out of your graveyard too as well, obviously. But the fact that it is the only card, I thought I definitely needed to give it a mention. Coming in at number 7, Ill-Gotten Gains. 2 black sorcery. Exile Ill-Gotten Gains. Each player discards their hand, then returns up to 3 cards from their graveyard to their hand. Just such an interesting card, such a unique effect, a really powerful effect, right? Getting all players to discard their hands for 4 mana is pretty darn good if you're in a discard theme. Now, of course, everyone gets to return 3 cards from their graveyard to their hand. So, you know, that can be really interesting. If you have effects like Leyline of the Void out, now your opponent's graveyards are all going to be exiled, so they're not going to be able to take advantage of this. Whether or not you want this for, I'm forcing my opponents all to discard, or you want the effect where I get 3 things back into my graveyard, yeah, your opponents do as well. If you're in a discard theme, you need your opponents to have cards in their hands, right? That Megrim or that Waste Knot or whatever the case may be that you have in play does literally nothing if your opponents don't have cards in their hand to discard. So this can sort of be like a wheel effect where, yes, I'm getting all those discard triggers when I make my opponents discard all their hands, but then they're going to pick some stuff up out of their graveyard so that they're then putting stuff back in their hand that they can then discard again, right? So it can sort of be a wheel effect there as well. Really interesting card. Speaking of really interesting cards, Ice Cave. This is a card that I've never seen before, and when I saw it, I had to read it over like 3 or 4 times. 3 blue enchantment. Whenever a player casts a spell, any other player may pay that spell's mana cost. If a player does, counter that spell. Holy cow, what a powerful and crazy effect, especially in a commander game where you got lots of players, right? Anytime any player casts a spell, any of that player's opponents can then go, hey, well, I got some mana up. You know, you cast that Path to Exile. I'll pay the 1 mana, and it has to include the color, right? So you have to have the white mana available. If your opponent has that white mana, they can pay the 1 white and counter that spell. That can obviously be an incredible incredibly powerful effect, and it can be incredibly annoying too for your opponents if they're trying to get stuff off. This can be particularly good if you're in a deck that has lots of colors, right? If you're in a 4 or 5 color deck, the mana cost includes colors, so you have to have that color available to you. Maybe it's good in a Send Triplets deck where you're sort of doing those kinds of things anyway, right? People will put Chromatic Lantern and stuff like that in their Send Triplets deck so that they can cast their opponent's stuff. So it might work great there. If you're in a deck where you just want to be countering stuff all the time, it can be great, like a Baral deck. But I think it's particularly good in a Taigam Ojutai Master deck where instant sorcery and dragon spells you control can't be countered by spells or abilities. So if you have your Ice Cave in play, now you can use this to counter your opponent's stuff. But if they try to counter your stuff, at least your instant sorceries and dragon spells, which of course in a Taigam deck, it's basically a Spellslinger deck. You're going to have lots of instants and sorceries. Your opponents won't be able to use this on yours if you have your commander in play. So I think it might be a great fit there as well. Just a really wild and crazy card. Coming in at number 9, another weird, crazy, interesting blue enchantment that I've never seen before, Illusionary Terrain. Blue and a blue enchantment, and it's got cumulative upkeep too. And as I've mentioned now a couple of times on my channel, cumulative upkeep really gets a bad name. I don't think it's that bad. When you play something that has cumulative upkeep, all of your opponents are going to be affected by it before you even have to pay the first upkeep. And then the first time around you pay the 2, that's not that bad. 2 mana is not bad. And then you get a whole nother cycle of turns where your opponents are affected by this. And depending on what that thing is doing, it can be really, really advantageous for you, and that is definitely the case here. As Illusionary Terrain enters the battlefield, choose 2 basic land types. Basic lands of the first chosen type are the second chosen type. What a weird card. So I think there's a couple of ways you can do this. So first thing you can do is, if my commander's got Island Walk, or something like that, or Swamp Walk, maybe like a Rexiel deck, this is a way that I can turn my opponent's lands into swamps or islands. Now my commander is unblockable. That's one way to use this card. But I think the best way to use this card is like a Blood Moon. This card works just like Blood Moon, where basic lands of the first chosen type are the second chosen type, right? They're not in addition to the other types. This just turns those lands into the other type. So if you choose, say for example, forests and islands, now this is going to turn all forests into islands. So all of your opponents that have forests, those lands are now islands. And obviously they're going to tap for blue mana. They're not going to tap for green mana. So the mono green player is going to be completely shut off by this. Probably they're not going to have any green mana to cast their stuff. The Atraxa player is going to be less put off by this, but again, might not be able to cast their commander if they don't have green mana. I mean, you get to choose the types, right? This is a card you could put in any deck, and depending on what your opponents are playing, you just choose the one type, change it into the other type, right? If your opponent's playing a Rakdos deck, you can maybe choose swamps and turn swamps into forests. Maybe you have another opponent who's playing an Orzhov deck. So if you're turning the swamps into forests, now you're going to hose both of those players. Really can be versatile. Just such a weird and crazy card, but can be really, really good at hosing your opponents. I'm definitely thinking of putting this in some of my decks. And coming in at number 10 this week is Ice Cauldron. And this is sort of an infamous card, most notably because of the ridiculous essay written on it, and it's been errated, of course. I think it's been errated a few times. I almost skipped over it. Again, it's one of those cards that it's just this goofy, funny card that you really don't pay much attention to. There's so much words on it. I almost passed it by, and then I thought, you know what? Let's take a look at it and see what we can do maybe. And this card, I think, is a lot better than maybe people think it is. So it's a 4-mana artifact, and you can pay X and tap. You may exile a non-land card from your hand. You may cast that card for as long as it remains exiled. Put a charge counter on Ice Cauldron and note the type and amount of mana spent to pay the activation cost. Activate only if there are no charge counters on Ice Cauldron. Let's deal with that first ability before we get to the second ability. So what this does is it exiles a card from your hand, and you may cast that card for as long as it remains exiled. If we ignore everything else, that ability on its own, I think, is fantastic. This is not tap this later and you can cast that card. You may cast that card for as long as it remains exiled. This is just like a Praetor's Grasp, where once that card's in exile, You can cast it for the rest of the game. Doesn't matter if your Ice Cauldron gets removed. So this is a great way to protect a card in your hand. If your opponent's about to wheel, you can just quickly exile a card from your hand. Don't have to pay any mana, right? X can be 0. I just exile a card from my hand. Now it's stuck in exile. I can cast it whenever I feel like it. Maybe it's my win con and I want to protect it. Great way to protect your cards there. Again, with the Hero of Bredegard thing, I'm exiling a card from my hand. Raynar, obviously the commander that this fits really great in. I don't have to pay any mana here. I can just tap this and exile a card from my hand, and it's going to give me that trigger from my commander. Any of the commanders that have come out recently where you're casting things from exile, this works because, again, I can just throw any card in my hand in exile and then immediately cast it like I normally would, and I'll get that trigger. A Vega the Watcher deck, it also works there. Any card that I would normally cast anyway, I'm going to cast my Soul Ring. I'll just tap my Ice Cauldron, exile it first, then cast it from exile, and I get that trigger. This card actually works really, really well in a lot of decks, and we haven't even gotten to the second ability yet. So the second ability says tap, remove a charge counter from Ice Cauldron, add Ice Cauldron's last noted type and amount of mana, spend this mana only to cast the last card exiled with Ice Cauldron. So as an added bonus, okay, now if we want to put mana into this, we can, right? All of that other stuff I already named was us just tapping this and putting 0 mana into it. Now, if it just so happens we have a couple of mana up, so again, same scenario where my opponent's about to wheel, I have a really important card in my hand, like my win con that I want to save, I don't want to discard. I'm going to put it in exile, and I can cast it whenever I want for the rest of the game. Now, since I have a couple of mana up, heck, why don't I just throw that mana into this ability as well, so that when I cast that spell later on in the game, if I still got my Ice Cauldron kicking around, now I can use that second ability and it's going to reduce the cost. It's sort of like Foretell. Very similar to Foretell, where I can stick this card in exile, put some mana into it, however much I want. I could put 1, 2, 10, so that when I cast it at a later time, it's going to be a lot cheaper, right? Really, really great card. Just so versatile. A lot of different things you can do with this. For me personally, I just love the idea of I can pay the 0 mana and just exile a card from my hand, and then it just sits there. And again, if your Ice Cauldron gets removed, doesn't matter. You may cast that card for as long as it remains exiled. For the rest of the game, that card will just sit there, just like a card in Foretell, and I can cast it whenever I want. I'm playing my Hazaret deck, right? Another deck where I want to be getting cards out of my hand. This also fits there as well. Just fits in so many decks, I think. But that is it for today. That is 10 more cards you should be putting in your commander decks. And if you are thinking of purchasing any of these cards, I have a TCG player link. Give it a click. It helps support the channel. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.